Welcome to The Christian Atheist, Episode 9, The Machinery of the Looking Glass, Part 5, Lessons from Jordan Peterson. My journey to the Looking Glass in July of 2019 was a long road, a quarter century in the making, and I've tried to be sequential in presenting its machinery. I hope to bring the story together in a final episode next week. In point of time, my final influence is the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson. God, I must say in retrospect, knew exactly what I needed and when I needed it. And Peterson came on the scene at precisely the right time for me to see some of my own foolishness, remind me of things I already knew, and to find the courage to take the steps he was opening for me to take. I do not know if Jordan Peterson is a believer, but I do know that God used him to help me see and understand what I needed to in order to step back through the looking glass. To him also I owe the name Christian Atheist, as I first heard him use it in one of his YouTube videos. I don't think he coined it, but I thought it particularly apropos to my situation when I began this vlog. I began studying philosophy as an undergraduate in an attempt to understand how our world had gone so badly wrong. I find it fascinating that Peterson did exactly the same thing with psychology at roughly the same time. He's 4 years older than me. My path led me, interestingly enough, by a different road to many of the same conclusions that Peterson presents. Intellectually, Peterson and I are mirror images, as I've taught nearly identical content from a philosophical perspective for most of my academic career, as my students would tell you. He also seems to have adopted truth as his central value, with an emphasis on individual responsibility. I have learned a great deal from Jordan Peterson in terms of practical psychology, but most of his conclusions on culture, academia, and our world I came to in the course of my own investigations. Whereas earlier episodes of The Machinery of the Looking Glass focused on my intellectual preparation for my theistic return, Jordan Peterson is primarily a practical influence. He reminded me of many things I already thought or knew, but had allowed to settle quietly in my inner sanctum. The Academy, I knew, would frown. For instance, I knew the Bible as one of the richest texts in the Western canon, boundless in insight and wisdom, but such knowledge and studies would get you nowhere in the Academy of today. I respected the Bible, but I no longer studied it, since I no longer believed. Peterson reminded me of its inexhaustible insight into the human condition. In many instances, his psychological insights, intrigued me back into a text that years of preaching and theological study had bored me away from. Not to mention the fetishism with which many in the Christian community hold the Bible, the overly facile explanations of issues and problems, the need to have everything resolved without residue, without tension. He brought me back to an open fascination with faith, knowledge, and truth that had languished over the years. In other words, Peterson jolted me out of complacence. How? By hitting me between the eyes with my own responsibility in the light of truth. If what I believe is true, what should I do? How should I act? For it is action that speaks most clearly of what we believe, hold to be true, and which changes and improves things. Things don't get better on their own. For years, my life had been lived in my thoughts, not in my actions. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unmanageable. He also forced me to face my own contributions to my life troubles. Inspired by his YouTube lectures, I bought his 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. I had given up self-help and pop psychology texts years ago, so I was uncertain what to expect. But while his online presence stimulated my intellectual resilience and confidence in my own conclusions on the troubles into which our society had so precipitously fallen, his practical advice invigorated my living, changed me for the better. Stand up straight, with your shoulders back, encouraged me to stand, metaphorically and physically, for myself and what I believed, to face my difficulties and voluntarily shoulder them, to run towards and not from a fight. I began and have sustained a physical exercise regimen that has transformed my physical well-being. To be fair, my wife's influence far outshines Peterson's on this point. As for maybe the first time in my life, I began to treat myself like someone I am responsible for helping. I learned to value incremental change in myself and my circumstances, and so as not to defeat myself, stop comparing myself to others, but only to myself yesterday. I acknowledged and took responsibility for my failures and inadequacies as both husband and father. Slowly, my shell began to peel back, and I began again to live. I know that for some of you, the mere mention of Jordan Peterson in a positive way means that I have nothing further to say of value to you. Such is the state of our ideological divide that stepping outside your particular box is unspeakable heresy. Oddly enough, it was Peterson, along with another contemporary hero of mine, Jonathan Haidt, that did more than anyone else to break down my own ideological walls, teaching me that ideologies are parasites on an underlying religious substructure. They are partial answers, unsubtle, resistant to the ambiguity and tension of real life. Peterson calls them crippled religions and a one-size-fits-all answer to every question. I said in the first edition of the Christian Atheist that I gave up ideology along with atheism. For myself, I have become unhappy with the labels usually used to identify the poles of this ideological divide. Liberal versus conservative fails on its face, as semantic drift now has conservatism taking the role of 19th century classical liberalism, and the left defending the status quo of our cultural and academic institutions, which they have transformed over the past decades into a rigid and exclusive orthodoxy, complete with its own shibboleths, a conservatism in its own right, and in the recent decade, nearly fascistic. The irony of Antifa is astounding in its zeal. I prefer the terms conservative versus radical, taking a long view of each term's meaning. These are the terms I adopted in my Intro to Philosophy course. I think they best represent the opposing tendencies that we humans bring to existence. Conservatism, a holding on to what is and has been, for reasons of safety, security, stability, and a respect for tradition, in opposition to radicalism, which is an enthusiastic openness to and embrace of all that is new, combined with a willingness to undermine and discard traditional views and practices. Most of us tend toward one or the other by nature. For a functioning society, one connected with life as it is lived and experienced, we need both tendencies, interacting and balancing each other. While our world constantly changes, it also stays the same. Competing ideologies, in balance, can be beneficial, but when one side or the other becomes predominant, the resulting orthodoxy can be devastating. Witness the 20th century. It is, Peterson points out, quite clear when the right wing goes too far, but much harder to define when the left wing does so. When I first heard this statement, I found it silly. Now, I think it is possibly the central question of our age. Peterson reminded me that the infinite richness and complexity of narrative indexes truth more clearly than any rationalized explanatory scheme. Truth is life, not an abstract set of axioms. Our intellect is useful, not infallible, and is only one of our tools with which to make sense of and live in this vale of tears. This is one area in which Peterson jarred my understanding away from philosophy towards a more psychological stance. Truth, I think, is far more complex, subtle, and profoundly connected with human life and existence, and too massive, profound, and transcendent, indeed magical, than I was willing to consider as a philosopher. This was Socrates' lesson, too. We create our lives in our actions, as we write stories with our pens. We are, in our very essence, storytelling animals. As I learned from Sartre's existentialism, whether we like it or not, we are anchored in our time, our place, and our culture, with a specific limitation of our DNA and a myriad of other specificities that define us. And from these constraints, we construct ourselves, tell our story. As individual beings, we are limited, but we are also all connected, the same. It is like our ideologies. We need one another to avoid the errors of our individual limitations and inadequate sight. Our mythologies tell our shared story. This is why there is such truth to be found in the great literatures and the arts of our world. It is in our stories, even today, that truth is most richly presented. Tolkien and Lewis thought of the biblical narrative as true myth, and that understanding appeals to me immensely. Peterson reminded me that everything I do matters. No excuses, no passes, no exceptions. This, too, is Sartrean. We are responsible for our world. Within our specific situations, we have tasks that need our doing. And doing things, taking up our cross, is hard. It involves suffering. But suffering is universal, unavoidable. Purposeful, intentional, voluntary suffering, though, brings meaning to our suffering. Being responsible involves sacrifice at all levels. It is not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. When we take up our cross, we can begin to improve the tragedy that is our being, and that of our world. And the two, individual suffering and universal suffering, are tied together. The Via Dolorosa is the hero story, the voluntary adoption of suffering to redeem the suffering world. That is, there is inherent in our world a way to act, to live, a path we all should walk. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, called it the Tao, and it is the universal ethical path that God built into the universe. I believe that path takes us inevitably to Christ, and it is my mission to point the way in every manner that I can. Our lives can contribute to the malevolence that rules our world, or through preparation, training, and action, we can learn to carry successively greater loads. We must necessarily start small, taking the motes out of our own eyes before attempting to take the beams out of others. As Peterson says, clean up your room. The servant who is faithful in small things is entrusted with greater responsibility. This is Peterson's core message, and it resonates with me deeply. Called me back to a recognition of a path that I'd abandoned many years ago, but which also anchors me in my core being: truth and responsibility. On Faith in God, Peterson reminded me of Kant's as if. When asked if he believed in God, he replied that he lives as if God exists. Not exactly satisfying, but it raises the question, what is faith in God? Due to circumstances and Peterson, I was again asking myself this question as an atheist, and it compelled the opposite question. Was I living as if God did not exist? Peterson's treatment of faith raised ambiguities for me, challenged me to open these questions again. Was I living what I believed? Was I even understanding what it means to believe? Or was I deceiving myself? Faith again, due in part to Peterson, became a living and open question for me. My final point is woven through the very fabric of the Christian atheist, from first to last. Because life is best understood as narrative and not as explanation, Peterson reminded me that ambiguity need not be overcome in order to live, and that its presence indicates a richness to be explored, not a deficiency to be remedied. Paradox is vital, fascinating, compelling, and, as a lover of poetry, ambiguity is life and soul. The aesthetic is not of secondary importance, but is, perhaps, as vital an index of truth as intellect. Hegel, properly understood, has much to teach us here. Jordan Peterson was the required influence in my life at the right time. I had allowed experience and circumstance to beat me down, making me a shell whose life had gone inside. God needed to revivify me, armor me against the dragons about to rise up in my life, to again take the field that I had ceded my foes, and arm myself for the conflict, to restore my confidence and find my strength and resolve, to be, that is, a man, with all that that means. Thank God for Jordan Peterson. I do. If you have not yet watched the previous episodes of The Christian Atheist, I encourage you now to subscribe and watch them. First, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And let us know what you'd like to hear from us by commenting. Wise Words for Your Occasion is located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but we're willing to travel. For inquiries or to book an occasion, go to wisewordsforyouroccasion.wordpress.com or see us on Facebook or check out our YouTube channel. You'll find links to all three in this post.